4 words destroyed my life. She's intubated. I had walked into my own kitchen humming a stupid song about summer and suitcases. 30 minutes later, I was on the linoleum, phone in my hand, listening to a nurse tell me that my daughter was in the intensive care unit. The contrast felt obscene. One moment I was arranging throw pillows and planning breakfast, and the next the house smelled like a place I no longer recognized, a faint chemical tang clinging to my sweater as if the memory of it could be washed out. The fluorescent strip lights of the hospital lobby buzzed when I arrived, cold and clinical. The beep of monitors seemed to push my breath out of me. I could feel the rough leather of my purse strap digging into my shoulder like a lead weight. My hands trembled. I promised myself then that I would find out every single piece of what had happened. I would not allow answers to be smoothed over by platitudes or legal evasions. I would get to the truth. The man at the center of that truth had a name. His name was Daniel Price. He was charming in ways that made people lower their guard. He was the one who had said he loved my daughter and who, on paper, should have been there to protect her. He was the one, according to a handful of messages I would later read, had been out that night drinking and laughing. I needed names, dates, records, witness accounts, bank transfers, and anything else that would tell the story he did not want told. I needed to turn a private catastrophe into a public accounting. When I reached the door to Emily's room, the smell hit first. Antiseptic and warm plastic, and underneath it a copper tang that made me want to cough. The room light was dimmed for rest, the curtains pulled tight, but the glow of a monitor painted her skin in a shallow, unsteady blue. Tubes and tapes framed her like a bizarre crown. Her hair was splayed on the pillow, damp at the temple, where someone had tried to cool a fever. There was a ring of dried blood at the angle of her jaw that made my stomach drop. Her hand, small and too pale, lay on top of the blankets. I took it. It was warm, but it did not squeeze back. Nurse Rosa Martinez was the first person who saw me meet my daughter's hand. She spoke in a voice that tried to be steady for my sake. She smelled faintly of hand lotion and coffee, and there was a hospital badge that flipped on her chest as she moved. Dr. Marcus Hale, the neurosurgeon, came with charts that rustled like leaves. Detective Aaron Blake arrived with a notepad and the careful cadence of someone who had heard too many versions of the same story. Social worker Maria Ruiz hovered with a folder full of brochures and a gentle gaze. Around us were humidifiers, carts with clipped instruments, the wet squeak of sneakers on linoleum. I remember the first exchange in the room like a shard of glass. I said, "What happened to her?" Nurse Rosa answered, "She arrived last night, found unresponsive, intubated for respiratory failure." I said, "Who found her?" Detective Blake said, "A neighbor, Tom Alvarez. He heard a car door slam and then silence." I said, "Where is Daniel?" Dr. Hale said, "Not present. There is evidence of trauma to the head. We operated. She is stable for now, but critical." I said, "Why not Daniel?" Detective Blake said, "He left the scene shortly after. Witness accounts put him at a bar 3 miles away." I said, "Did she have any allergies? Was she on medication?" Nurse Rosa said, "She was not on medication as listed by records. No known allergies noted in the chart." I said, "Can I see her phone?" Detective Blake said, "We will need consent. For now, we are preserving evidence. We have secured the scene." I said, "Preserve what? Who called emergency services?" Detective Blake said, "Tom called emergency services at 3:52 a.m. We have statements coming in." The exchanges kept coming. Each sentence felt like a small tool I could use to pry loose the next piece of a sealed box. There was a frisson of professional calm around the edges, a set of practiced motions that made the chaos manageable. But the thinness of that calm was terrifying. There were moments when the clinical words felt like a language being spoken around me rather than to me, as if they belonged to a report rather than a person I loved. I left the room with a photocopied sheet that had the basic intake information and the name of the responding EMT. In the corridor, I spoke to Tom Alvarez, the neighbor, who smelled of rain and lawn cuttings. He repeated with a small, quivering voice that he had heard a single loud thump and then the sound of footsteps leaving. He had thought it might be a late night, nothing more. He had not called sooner because the house had lights on and he assumed everything was fine. His confession was an ember of guilt in me. I filed it away as information and as a shape of the evening. Back at my car, I called Sarah Whitman, Emily's oldest friend, the one who had a key and who knew the rhythms of their household. Sarah answered on the second ring, breathless with the kind of worry I had been trying to hold at bay. She said, "I left at 11:30. They were fine. They were watching a show. I texted her at midnight and she read it. That was the last I saw her." Her voice had the flattened sound of someone who had held on to certainty until it was pulled out from under her. At that point, the investigation felt both urgent and bewildering. Everything I had expected to be discreet and contained now felt porous. The first night, I sat in the back of the hospital chapel for a while, the small wooden bench grinding into my knees. I thought about the silence in the house where I had been earlier and how easy it was to miss a sign. I thought about the way Emily had laughed 2 nights earlier during a phone call, the way she had told me about a promotion at work, and about how she wanted to adopt a small dog. I wanted to hold on to those small, ordinary details because they were proof that the life she had was real and that it was now threatened. My backstory is not some neat preface. I was not a detective or a lawyer when Emily was born. I worked in nonprofit development, negotiating grants and managing teams. I had been a single mother in my 30s, juggling late nights and school projects, balancing budgets and bedtime stories. I was raised in a small Midwestern town by parents who taught me to keep my promises. My marriage had ended amicably years ago. I had learned to be both practical and compassionate. Those were not heroic qualities. They were the toolbox I had built over decades. I have scars from choices made in haste and wisdom gathered through hardship. I believed in transparency and in the power of paperwork to expose truth. Those skills would come to define how I responded to my daughter's crisis. I knew how to read a balance sheet. I knew how to ask a bank for a transaction history. I knew how to follow a paper trail. I had never imagined I would use those skills at such a personal scale. When I began the initial investigation, I moved with a kind of focused rage. The first thing I did was preserve what was still malleable. I asked Detective Blake to inventory any devices found at the scene. He recorded serial numbers and assured me that the phone would be treated as evidence. I wrote down the names of nurses who had been on shift and made sure the attending physician documented the condition in detail. I started compiling an outline of the night, listing places, people, timings. I made lists the way I had made grant checklists at work. Lists felt like something I could control. I spoke with Linda Chin at First National Bank. Her voice was precise and bureaucratic, slightly flat the way people who work with numbers often sound. She asked for my identification, my relationship to Emily, and legal authorization. I told her I would get a court order if necessary. She said, "We can place a temporary hold and flag the account, but we will need legal authorization to release transaction histories." I said, "Flag everything. Make any holds you can. Notify fraud if there are unusual ATM withdrawals." She said, "We will." Need a subpoena to release detailed records, but we can provide a ledger for suspicious activity if law enforcement requests it. I said, "I will coordinate with the detective." I called Instagram and asked about location tagging. Their automated system routed me through options that felt designed to be difficult. I sent emails and compiled screenshots. There were photos that Emily had been tagged in of Daniel at a bar at 2 a.m. with a woman whose face I did not recognize, laughing with a drink in his hand. The timestamps were small digital truths. There were debit card transactions that placed him at a downtown club at 1:30 in the morning, and then a withdrawal at 3:10 at an ATM 1 mile from their house. I printed everything and stored it in a folder. The technical steps for securing digital evidence and financial records are precise. To get phone records, we requested a preservation order from the service provider. followed by a subpoena through the detective. For bank records, we submitted a formal request with the account number and range of dates, and we worked with the bank fraud unit to freeze suspicious transfers. For social media, we downloaded posts, metadata, and geotags, and preserved screenshots with timestamps. These processes are slow by design to protect privacy, but in a case like this, the delay felt like an enemy. The preservation order and the subpoena are legal mechanisms that prevent deletion and compel production. They take time, but they are essential. About a third of the way into my work, a new piece of evidence appeared that shifted everything. I was looking at a set of security camera stills from the apartment complex next door when I noticed a car that did not match Daniel's model parked near the walkway at 3:48 a.m. The stills captured a shadowy figure leaving the house at 3:51 a.m. The angle was poor, but the gate looked familiar to me from 1,000 family videos. I felt a coldness settle over my shoulders. I called Detective Blake and I asked him to enlarge the frames. He did. The image resolved into the shape of a person with a baseball cap, hunched against the cold. The knowing hit me like a physical blow. It meant there was a witness who might have seen more, or someone who had been coming and going. It meant the story could be more complex than a drunken mistake. At this point, I will pause and speak to you directly. I know this is hard to listen to. If you have ever sent something off and then later discovered you were right, you understand the mix of guilt and vindication that settles over a moment like this. I want to invite you to share in the comments what small sign you once missed that in hindsight made sense. Start your message with the words, "The sign was so people can find similar stories easily." Your memory could help someone else notice a pattern before it becomes a tragedy. If you feel comfortable, share what you did next and what you wish you had done differently. We are not here to shame. We are here to support and to help each other recognize danger earlier. Your story could be the nudge another person needs to act. Back to the timeline. With the new camera stills, we widened the circle of inquiry. I called Linda again and asked for any card presentment in the early morning hours. I asked Sarah for any messages she might have missed. I called Emily's workplace, a small design firm where she had been on the rise, speaking to her manager, Jenna Morales, who said Emily had left the office early the previous day because she was not feeling well and that she had seemed tired but not distressed. It felt like watching a prism split light into fragments. None of the fragments made sense by themselves, but together they suggested structure. Escalation happened in two forms. One was procedural and the other was confrontational. Procedurally, I moved to protect assets and to make sure medical decisions would be informed. I contacted the accountant who managed their shared finances, a woman named Linda Park, who placed a temporary freeze on transfers that looked out of pattern. I spoke to a lawyer, Mark Reed, who advised me on the steps to petition the court for temporary conservatorship over certain joint accounts. In the background, I was also arranging for Emily to have a medical power of attorney granted to a trusted person in case she remained incapacitated. The paperwork, the signatures, the stamps all felt like a scaffold being built in case the house of cards collapsed. Confrontationally, I began to put pressure on Daniel. I sent messages asking him to come to the hospital. I called his friends and colleagues. I asked him directly in a voicemail if he had been with Emily that night. I recorded his evasions. I told him that I had evidence placing him away from the house. He responded at first with silence, then with a short text that said, "I was not there when it happened." He did not call. When I showed up at his door, he would not answer. That is when I started publicizing certain findings. The purpose was not to shame for the sake of shaming. It was to make the case that absence and obfuscation could not stand unchallenged. The pressure needed to be both legal and social. There were moments of tension that felt almost unbearable. One evening, the nurse called me and said Emily had taken a turn. Her blood pressure dropped and the monitors alarmed. I ran from the waiting area into the room. My legs felt hollowed out. The lines of tubing seemed to multiply before my eyes. I shouted to Dr. Hale to move faster. He moved with calm efficiency. I could hear that his jaw was tight. The machines beeped in a panic. the soft crackle of plastic giving way to the metallic clink of instruments. For a breathless 10 minutes, the world contracted to the size of that room and the sound of the monitors. Then the numbers steadied. The tension did not leave me for days. That moment changed how I slept and how I thought about control. Another moment of acute tension came during a phone call when Daniel's attorney, a slick man named Paul Klein, threatened that any social media dissemination would be met with legal action. He spoke of defamation and lunged with legal terms as if they were weapons. I listened and then told him plainly that the truth was a defense. There was a silence on the line when he realized I was not going to be bullied into quiet. The tension was not only emotional, it was procedural. It was a contest over narrative control. As the escalation progressed, the web of connections widened. I found a pattern of small exploitations that suggested Daniel had been manipulating more than just my daughter. An insurance policy taken out recently in Emily's name showed a discrepancy in beneficiaries. When I called the agent, a man named Peter Larkin, he said the beneficiary was changed 3 months ago. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. These were not accidental omissions. These were edits. I began to contact other women who had known Daniel in different roles. One woman named Laura Nguyen, who had gone to college with him, told me similar stories of persuasion and sudden abandonment. Another, named Michelle Torres, said she had been a recipient of a vague promise that had never materialized. The more I spoke to people, the more the pattern looked like strategy, not mistake. Investigators performed technical steps to verify timelines. Digital forensics recovered metadata from Emily's phone that showed a gap in the cellular pings between 2:54 a.m. and 4 a.m. Security cameras were subpoenaed and the images enhanced by the county lab. Bank fraud analysts cross-referenced debit transactions with card presentment locations and ATM network data. These technical descriptions are necessary to understand how loose threads become a coherent narrative. The processes take hours of grinding work by people who sit in small rooms staring at code and timestamps, pulling forward a line of proof from a tangle of noise. When Detective Blake and I confronted Daniel, it was not in a dramatic scene with shouting. It was a careful, cataloged exchange in a sterile interview room. He sat across from a table, his hands folded, his face an expression he probably thought conveyed regret. I asked him what he remembered from that night. He said, "I had a few drinks, we argued, then I left." I asked him who he had messaged after leaving. He said, "I do not remember." I asked him why there were transactions at a club at 1:30 and an ATM withdrawal at 3:10. He said, "I do not recall." The answers were small and evasive. The detective pressed on logistics and timings, and I watched Daniel's composure crack in small increments. At one point, he looked at me and said, "I never wanted this to happen." I asked him if he had called emergency services. He said, "No." There was a long silence. The room smelled faintly of coffee. The tension in that moment was a slow, grinding thing. The detective read witness statements and put them in front of him. He asked again about his movements. Daniel's answers became shorter, more clipped. The arrest followed once sufficient evidence established probable cause. The mechanics of an arrest are deceptively simple. An officer presents the person with their rights, explains the charges, reads the weight of the accusations, and then takes custody. In this case, the charges were initially assault and leaving the scene of an incident, later upgraded as more evidence around intoxication and negligence was processed. The paperwork for the arrest was thick with codes and legal citations. It took officers several hours to gather statements, finalize the charges, and process Daniel. He was booked, photographed, and placed in a holding cell where the light was fluorescent and the air smelled of disinfectant. The procedural description is bleak but necessary. It is the point at which private suffering is converted into public process. Court hearings followed rapid initial arraignment and then longer pretrial procedures. There were conversations with the prosecutor, Angela Park, who was steady and direct. She described the evidence succinctly and outlined the path forward. I had moments of triumph when the judge set bail terms and imposed restrictions. I had moments of frustration when paperwork slowed and when defense motions sought to exclude pieces of evidence. The legal system is a machine that turns hard facts into contested narratives. It requires patience and persistence. Recovery for Emily began in small steps. She spent weeks in a rehabilitation unit relearning coordination and speech patterns that had been knocked off their rails by trauma. She had to relearn to hold a spoon without trembling, to read a sentence without losing her place, to laugh without fear. Her therapy team included Dr. Hale for surgical follow-up, a physical therapist named Jason Kim, an occupational therapist named Clara Esposito, and a speech therapist named Nadine Lopez. Each of them brought patience and incremental triumphs. The first time she walked with a cane down the corridor, I felt my chest open the way a window opens in a storm. It was not an end, it was a beginning. There were practical decisions to make about their apartment and the mortgage. I worked with Linda Park, the accountant, to set up an emergency budget and to make sure bills were paid. We discussed selling certain assets, pausing automatic transfers, and applying for short-term disability through Emily's employer. The community rallied. Friends organized meal trains. Jenna Morales at the design firm arranged flexible work accommodations. Small acts made a huge difference. Therapy for me was not optional. I started meeting with a counselor named Dr. Elaine Brooks for weekly sessions. She taught me grounding techniques that kept me from being overcome by images in the night. She taught me how to sit with uncertainty without collapsing into action that would be counterproductive. I accepted help from a support group for families of trauma survivors, where I met others who were walking similar tightropes between anger and hope. The political refrain in those rooms was the same. Do the work, take the paperwork, demand facts, and be gentle with yourself. There were moments of escalation in the legal arena as well. Defense attorneys tried to paint the social media posts as out of context. There were attempts to subpoena private messages that had been shared in confidence. We fought to keep certain medical records private while making others public in the interest of proving negligence. The clamor around the case made sleep difficult. It also made it possible to seek restitution when it became clear that there had been financial manipulation. The revelations continued to unspool. It turned out that Daniel had been in communication with at least 2 other women over the past year with similar patterns of promises and sudden distance. Insurance paperwork showed that a beneficiary change had been attempted and then reversed. Multiple witnesses corroborated his presence at places where he had later claimed he had not been. Each new connection tightened the narrative. It did not absolve him of the immediate harm that had been done to Emily, but it did place his actions in a broader context. The climactic courtroom confrontation happened on a gray morning. The gallery smelled of stale coffee. I sat near Emily as witnesses described the timeline, as detectives testified to preserved phone logs, and as bank analysts explained transaction trails. Daniel took the stand for a brief moment and spoke in halting sentences. The prosecutor cross-examined with care, putting time-stamped social media posts and ATM records side by side. The tension in the room was thick. At one point, the judge admonished counsel for a line of questioning that flirted with irrelevance. In the end, the jury was asked to decide whether the evidence proved negligence and whether it rose to a criminal level. The deliberation felt interminable, but when the verdict came, it was a release. The jury returned with a conviction on the counts of leaving the scene and reckless endangerment. The sentence included probation, a suspended jail term contingent on completion of rehabilitation programs, and a restitution order aimed at covering medical expenses. It was not a clean justice. It was a compromise. It was also accountability. The immediate recovery period was messy and full of small milestones. Emily relearned to cook on a countertop that felt too high. She relearned how to text without autocorrect, turning our memories into... There were scars along her scalp where the surgery had been done, and a quietness sometimes in her voice that made me aware that trauma lodges itself in places you cannot see. Therapy was a daily fixture. We established routines that included speech exercises, walks in the park, and sessions with a trauma-informed therapist who specialized in intimate partner-related injury. Financial restitution began slowly. The bank returned certain disputed transfers after an internal review flagged suspicious activity. The insurance company processed part of the claim. A community fundraiser organized by Jenna and Sarah brought in thousands of dollars that paid for physical therapy beyond what insurance covered. The practical support was as real as the legal outcomes. People named in the story continued to be resources. Dr. Hale provided ongoing consultation. Nurse Rosa checked in occasionally with a quick text. Detective Blake updated us on the legal timeline. Each named person helped stitch back a life that had been unraveled. Epilogue 1 month later. 1 month after the incident, Emily was out of the hospital and living with me for a while. We had moved her toothbrush and a few favorite mugs to a spare bathroom and shared meals that were mostly soup and gentle conversation. The medical bills were stacking up, but the insurance had covered surgery and many of the immediate rehab sessions. The prosecutor had announced that restitution proceedings would begin in civil court, and we had a tentative plan to pursue damages for both medical costs and a claim for emotional distress. Emily could walk unassisted for short distances and was practicing speech exercises twice a day. She had started a daily journal to monitor memory and language improvements. We were attending family therapy sessions and weekly meetings with a support group for people who had experienced sudden trauma. Emotionally, the month felt like a liminal space where fear and gratitude collided. We were acutely aware of how fragile progress can be, but also how incremental wins compound into real change. Epilogue 3 months later. 3 months in, Emily returned to part-time work at her design firm. Jenna had rearranged schedules to help. We had a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery who introduced us to tools that helped regulate panic. Financially, we had recovered a portion of the disputed funds and had a civil suit pending for additional restitution and compensation. The media attention had subsided to a handful of local pieces that documented the legal outcomes and the charges. A small nonprofit that supports survivors of intimate violence invited us to speak about recognizing patterns of coercion and manipulation. Emily agreed to share a short statement about boundaries and the importance of preserving evidence. Our community had donated time and money and offered practical assistance. On days when the memory surfaced, we would sit together in silence, sometimes watching old comedies just to remember how it felt to laugh without the weight of fear. Epilogue 6 months later. 6 months after that night, Emily had regained a large part of her independence. Her speech had returned to 90% of what it had been, and her balance had improved to the point where she felt confident attending events with friends. The legal process had moved forward with a settlement that included financial restitution and a court order that prevented Daniel from contacting her. He was enrolled in a mandated accountability program and had restrictions placed on his movements as part of the agreement. We had established a small fund to help others in similar situations, pooling donations that had come in during the height of the coverage. The fund supported legal consults and short-term housing for those who had urgent needs. We spoke at one event aimed at educating families about digital evidence preservation and how to work with law enforcement to secure records. The overarching feeling was not one of victory. It was a sense of hard-earned stability and a knowledge that recovery is neither linear nor complete, but that over time, resilience can be rebuilt into a new normal. In the end, the story taught me things I did not expect to learn. I learned how quickly ordinary life can be fractured. I learned the value of keeping receipts, of preserving messages and screenshots, and of treating instinctive concerns as data points rather than as embarrassment. I learned that friends can become scaffolding and that legal structures, while imperfect, can be leveraged to create accountability. Most of all, I learned that recovery is not a solitary journey. It involves a community of professionals, friends, and strangers who offer expertise and compassion. If you are watching this and you recognize patterns, please act. If someone in your life seems to disappear, if their explanations do not line up with records or with simple facts, consider documenting what you can. Screenshot posts, save messages, make notes of times and places. Contact local authorities if you believe a crime has occurred. Reach out to support networks and to professionals who can help you navigate both medical and legal steps. And if you are in immediate danger, call local emergency services. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing. We will continue to document the recovery and the ongoing civil processes. We will bring experts on how to preserve digital evidence, how to work effectively with law enforcement, and how to access resources for survivors. Subscribing helps us build a community that shares information without sensationalism. I will end with this. We did not allow this event to define us. We handled the paperwork and the panic, the legal maneuvers and the quiet moments of doubt. We rebuilt with small acts of consistency. The night took much from us, but it also revealed who would stand beside us and who would not. In the ruins, we found a resilience that was practical and communal. That resilience is, in the end, the thing that saved us.